Hello, and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Dan Barker. I'm co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and we're coming to you today live from the Stephen Uhl Friendly Atheist Studio right here in Freethought Hall, which is the national office of the Freedom from Religion Foundation in Madison, Wisconsin. Today's show, as you saw, is Southern Poverty Law Center Confronts Christian Nationalism. Each year, the SPLC issues its hard-hitting and highly respected Year in Hate and Extremism report, which came out last week and is available on their website. For the first time, they have dedicated a significant portion of the report to the threat of Christian nationalism. Earlier in 2022, FFRF, with the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, issued a report on how Christian nationalism influenced the January 6th insurrection, a report that was mentioned, by the way, on the floor of the House of Representatives. Many of those findings have been endorsed by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and joining me today in the studio is FFRF staff attorney Chris Line. How's it going?
It's going well, Dan.
We had fun the last time we talked about your weight loss.
We should do all the shows. If you have a question during today's show, you can put it in the Facebook comments or send us an email at askanatheist@ffrf.org. The show's called Ask an Atheist, but today we have a question for you, our audience. On a scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being the most, how much of a threat do you think Christian nationalism is in the United States, and why? You can answer that question in the comments section or send us an email at askanatheist@ffrf.org. Keep it family friendly and we might read it on the air. And remember, FFRF is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization, so we cannot take sides in partisan elections and don't endorse any such views that might be expressed today.
So thanks, Chris. And now, joining us from the Southern Poverty Law Center is Joseph Wiinikka-Lydon. He's a Senior Research Analyst. He's going to talk about this Year in Hate and Extremism report. So Joseph, welcome to Ask an Atheist.
Thank you so much, and feel free to call me Joe, too. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Very good, Joe. And you can call me Dan, and Chris. So you guys are doing great. You've been doing great work for many, many decades, going way, way back to, the Ku Klux Klan and all of that. So how did the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, reach the conclusion that Christian nationalism is now a clear threat in the United States?
Yeah, no, we've actually, for many decades, we've seen in what we call the anti-government movement, it used to be called the Patriot movement, had very strong Christian nationalist roots. In fact, the Patriot movement, which was originally called the Christian Patriot movement, and it was motivated and informed by theologies that we call dominionism. And it's really just, to put it simply, is really theocracy, or a form of Christian supremacy throughout society and politics. So we've seen that that's kind of like at the beginning of this anti-government movement. Through like the 90s and when kind of the militias hit a peak, and you can kind of think about the Ruby Ridge, what happened with the Branch Davidians in Texas, that religious language, that theology wasn't always put first, but it was still there. And what we're seeing now really is not just a resurgence of a lot of these ideologies and these political visions, but they've kind of spread out and are actually seeping into the mainstream. So one of the things that we're most alarmed about now is the fact that it has gone from the margins and is entering into what we've had considered mainstream political discourse.
So a lot of reports on social topics like this are written each year, but they're not, they don't always go that far. Sometimes they're kind of just left. Nobody really uses them. But each year, the Southern Poverty Law Center, your report stands out. It's often cited on the Hill and in numerous media reports. Why do you think your report in particular receives so much attention?
Yeah, I was, for many years before I joined SPLC, I was an academic, so I was used to putting out writings that nobody really reads. So it's nice to be in a place where it has some impact.
Where did you teach?
Where did I teach?
Yeah.
I taught a bunch of places. Birmingham College, Denison University. I taught at University of the Czech Republic for a while. So yeah, I'm kind of all over the place.
Wow.
So it's an interesting question, and I think SPLC kind of has a storied history targeting the Klan, and playing a strong role in that. But the United States has always had more than its fair share of fringe politics and theologies, and I think people have an awareness of this, and they're worried about it. And I think what the Year in Hate and this map, as well as the work of our partner organizations, I think for some it helps with isolation. I've met people in my work at SPLC and prior who kind of feel like they're the only person who's seeing this, the only person who's worried about kind of these extremist ideas. For some, they're seeing it, and it's just having somebody else tell them, yeah, what you're seeing is actually true, right? What you're seeing, we're kind of help with some of the gaslighting that happens to kind of cut through that. And also, I think it's just very comforting for people and sometimes energizing for people to see that somebody is keeping track of this, somebody is looking at it. And SPLC, we've been doing this for decades. It's one of the longest research projects on extremism. So we've built up some credibility, at least not with everybody, but enough credibility. And we try to cut through some organizations, like I know we'll be talking about Family Research Council and others, that really want to portray themselves as mainstream and have a very respectable veneer. And we try to cut through that. And I think we kind of help give some words and images and literal map for what people themselves are seeing.
Yeah, I'd say we're definitely happy here that SPLC is jumping on board with this, because I know we've been dealing with Christian nationalism for a long time. I mean, FFRF's been on it for decades, and to see now not just SPLC, but lots of mainstream outlets, covering it and it being exposed is so important. But when we talk about Christian nationalism, there's a bunch of different players involved. I know that your report highlights some people like Mike Flynn and the Reawaken America tour. I was just looking online. I happened to find just in the past couple of days, just a couple examples of Christian nationalism I just wanted to share. These are literally within the past couple of days. First, we have a clip that we can show. We'll talk about it.
We need to have Christians running for every single public office in this nation, every single state legislative seat, every single seat in Congress and the United States Senate, every single mayoral race, every single city council race, every county judge's race, every sheriff's race, every single elected office in the nation.
Yeah, so you can see and obviously I mean, and this is an important thing to cover with Christian nationalism, that he's not talking about just Christians, because the majority of our lawmakers are Christians, just not the ones that, someone like him would be advocating for.
Yeah, well, when I was a preacher, I used to believe that this was God's, the colonists came over here to set up the city on a hill, right? And that this country was founded as a Christian nation, and that Christians are the only true values voters. And I'm embarrassed to say I used to preach like that. But what's the danger, Joe? I mean, people can have ideas, right? People can think, but what is the actual real-life danger here we're talking about?
Yeah, like somebody talking about this, you kind of hit that on the head. Part of the danger is they are conflating all Christians with a very narrow understanding that is kind of authoritarian, very exclusivist, right? So one, they're doing damage to Christianity itself and the wide variety of this 2 billion strong tradition, right? Which creates a lot of division. It creates a lot of animosity between people. Where it really is dangerous and where it's kind of where the rubber's hitting the road is, and I think we'll talk about this, local politics and also education. There's a real attack on books being in libraries. Book banning is happening, and the attempt to eliminate histories and people that don't conform to this vision of white Christian nationalism. So the danger is not just that it's a thought or an ideology, but it's one that's very exclusive. It looks at pluralism as a danger. And so it's really looking at a lot of their neighbors as dangerous, looking at their neighbors as the enemy. And I don't think that that is, that right there kind of sets it beyond the pale. I think, did you also want to say some of the other major groups or drivers as well, or?
Yeah, I mean, we can just show, and I mean, some people might be familiar. We have another clip of Sean Foyt, who's been going around to all the different state capitals and really infusing religion. Well, 2 days ago, he was in the U.S. Capitol, and he actually took communion there and put out this disturbing video that we have a little short clip of.
The blood of Jesus, it speaks a better word. Speaks a better word than the sin, than the perversion, than the darkness, than the confusion, than the heaviness. The blood of Jesus that speaks a better word. We declare your blood over America. We declare the blood of Jesus over this nation, the blood of Jesus over D.C., the blood of Jesus over the United States Capitol. We thank you, Jesus, for your blood that covers, sets us free. And together today, God, we declare your blood, the power of your blood.
Yeah, so that could be the trailer for the Christian nationalism movie. You know,
so it's a free country, okay? Obviously, we allow people to have these views, but to me, that just seems like woo-woo, you know, sprinkling the blood over the Capitol.
Yeah, they're obsessed with blood. It's always, there's this weird trend through like Christian nationalism of like, the blood of Jesus is always really disturbing.
Well, okay, but those are their beliefs, but still, to think that they can actually dominate our government.
Right.
So, Joe, we've heard about these people for decades, you know, for years, people who think it's a Christian nation and who want to influence, and the religious right has been working diligently for decades, especially like on women's rights and abortion rights. But I want to ask you, did the idea of Christian nationalism gain a lot of momentum after Trump was elected?
I'd say so. I know there's a lot of kind of quantitative research being done around this, but I think especially with Trump being elected, especially I think a lot of it started actually with the Obama administration. We saw a huge spike in anti-government movements. This kind of it didn't quite stay the same level, but usually what we see is with anti-government movements, which including Christian nationalism, is when there's a Democrat in office, there's a surge of membership. When a Republican comes in office, it kind of ebbs. With President Trump, it ebbed, but not like we have seen in previous presidents. It kind of stayed at a higher pitch, at least from the research that we've done. And that was kind of exacerbated then by the 2020 election and COVID as well. So when we kind of came out of all of that, we really have a larger pool of people who've been radicalized, and extremism that you can see has entered even to the mouths of politicians. So I think it was a really powerful period for the growth of, say, white Christian nationalism, absolutely. And if you look at January 6th, you can see, sadly, I don't think that's the fruit of that. I think that's just a sign of where we can possibly be going. We can possibly go in the future.
Do you think January 6th was a high point or a low point? Is it over now, or was that just the beginning?
I think it can be very comforting for us to say that it's over, that January 6th happened, and now the government's taking care of it. But if you see the way, like, you know, some of the videos that you've already seen, this is kind of a rallying moment for a lot of people, especially those who hold kind of white Christian nationalist identities. They look at January 6th not as a defeat or even being chastised. They see it as a great injustice, right? They don't look at it as a crime. They don't look at it as attacking democracy. They don't look at it as an insurrection. So it's actually a moment where they feel that liberty and democracy has been wronged. Now, I think very deeply, and I think you can show it very clearly that they're not wrong with that. But I think that what we'll see and what we're seeing is it's much more of a rallying cry than it is the peak and the high water mark.
Well, the right, and especially the religious right, like to talk about law and order, right? Now, a lot of these people are in jail and are convicted for this crime. Do they or don't they respect the rule of law?
Well, you always have to ask that question. It's a good question to bring up, right? And you always have to follow it with law and order for whom and over whom, right? And I think what happens when we start seeing this movement, when we see moments like this, we start understanding that it's not law and order where it's applied equally to everyone. There's privileging that's going on, right? And there's an assumption that some people have to be under law and order, and an assumption that other people don't. And I think that's sometimes you see videos on TV or the web or social media where somebody is really, really confused and exasperated that maybe law and order will apply to them, right? Yeah. So I think we start gaining a little bit of the mentality by asking that question and seeing that they're providing the answer for us.
Well, because I used to preach that God's law is higher than human-made laws. And so that gives them an excuse, doesn't it, to say, well, we're above the law. So for...
And we saw...
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Going back all the way to the Christian patriot movement, that, and it's coming up today again, that if a law does not resonate or agree with what you think of as biblical values or biblical law or God's law, you have a duty to break it. Yeah. Right. So exactly that kind of theology has been there, and I think it's expanding. Yeah.
So we're going to have a few more questions and get questions from our audience. But before, let me just remind the audience who we're talking to. We're talking with Joe Wiinikka-Lydon. He's a Senior Research Analyst at the Southern Poverty Law Center. He's a co-author of the seminal Year in Hate and Extremism report, and he co-wrote a section on the threat of Christian nationalism.
You'd also like to remind everyone, if you have a question for Joseph, please put it in the comments section or send us an email at askanatheist@ffrf.org. And we hope you'll answer today's audience question. On a scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being the most, how much of a threat do you think Christian nationalism is in the United States, and why?
So, social media. We've been talking about the effect of social media at all levels. In the past few years, it's obviously amplifying extremist messages, including Christian nationalism. What are some of the mechanisms, do you think, Joe, by which these platforms have contributed to the spread of these extremist views?
Yeah, I think a lot of some of the work that we have a data lab, and we have some really great researchers and computer scientists, and they do a lot looking at the way in which social media platforms do or don't kind of try to stop extremism from coming in, right? And I think a lot of these platforms can do a lot more. Matthew Taylor is actually really good on this. He's a Protestant scholar, and he's argued, looking at some of the right-wing dominionist theology, he's argued that a lot of what's happening right now, especially kind of in the independent charismatic world, which is driving a lot of this, is that theology has become a meme, right? A lot of the theology that's out there that's kind of this extreme white Christian nationalism, dominionist, theocratic theology isn't spread by theological tracts, even so much sermons, though that's out there. You see on social media, you'll see memes. So an example of this is the Appeal to Heaven flag, which apparently was not created by, but George Washington had it created for the U.S. Navy. And it's been used as this way to, like you were saying, appeal to heaven over government, over society, directly to the divine source, to give them authority over government, over society, and over culture. And this idea spreads through an image. And what's so powerful about that is, you can get a lot of people who will sign on and see their issues in that image because it's not strictly defined. So you see this appeal to heaven a lot of people can kind of get behind that. It's kind of like saying critical race theory without defining it. People will define it for themselves, and it's a way, almost like an umbrella technique, where it brings in many more people than would be there otherwise. If you started actually talking about specifics of ideology and theology, people would kind of go away. But you really see through these memes and the way that kind of it seems that from what we're seeing from research that social media works, people really respond much more strongly to the negative than to positive or affirmations on social media. So it may even be that the media itself kind of leans toward more extreme beliefs. And so we need a great deal more to try to mitigate that as much as we can.
So what about freedom of speech? I mean, aren't people free to express and hold extremist views?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's the freedom of speech. You know, the social media platforms, if we're talking about that specifically, you know, they're not covered under the First, I'm not a lawyer, but they're not covered the way that government is under the First Amendment. They're private companies. So they actually have they have some interesting leeway that they could use to try to restrict some of this. So when we're talking about free speech, we have to be careful because certainly toward the government, we want to make sure that people aren't silenced, right? When we talk about social media and these other platforms, it gets a bit more difficult. If we kind of come in and discuss social media, discuss freedom of belief more broadly than just what's in the Bill of Rights, we do have an interesting conversation there. I think one of the problems that we can push back on extremism is so many of those opinions are really not well-informed opinions. They're not opinions that have been come from a real, honest, critical appraisal of information out there. So I think that we do have a duty and a responsibility as neighbors, as people in this country, to push back on opinions that are, you know, you can have an opinion, but if you're really trying to spread opinions that are ill-formed, that's not helping anyone. It's not even helping the person who's spreading the opinion, right? So I think that there's, we talk about throwing around opinion a lot and saying, well, it's my opinion, but not all opinions are equal. We have to really do the hard work to make sure that what we're saying, what we're thinking, actually reflects reality and is inclusive of a lot of different other experiences.
Yeah, Christian nationalism has been observed to have a significant influence on certain political movements or parties. In your research, did you find any instances where Christian nationalist ideology directly impacted policymaking or legislative initiatives or anything like that? And if so, could you provide some examples or discuss the consequences of that?
Sure. I think you can see this with a lot of the book banning and attacks on education. I'll talk about one that's a bit more specific. It's this initiative that was called Project Blitz, and Frederick Carlson at Political Research Associates, which is a peer organization of SPLC, has done a lot of writing on this. And Project Blitz was kind of a Christian right state legislative campaign, kind of like a legislative mill. If anybody knows, if the audience knows about ALEC, which is also kind of one of these legislative mills that turns out legislation that a local state legislator can just pick up and run with in their state. So this initiative was sponsored by, and they would create playbooks, not just with legislation, but talking how to make their legislation sound more secular so they can kind of slip in the theology that they really want. And these were sponsored by the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation, which I think has about 33 state chapters, the National Legal Foundation, which is a small Christian right law firm, and the Pro-Family Legislative Network, which is led by David Barton, who is right-wing extremist, and he's also a Republican political operative. And they together have kind of created this Project Blitz that a lot of legislators have used. The Texas-based religion scholar David Brockman kind of calls it a covert campaign for conservative Christian dominion over law and public policy. So their guide first appeared in 2017, and they've kind of walked back the name of Project Blitz. But they've had a number of successes where they have put in bills that are encouraging public prayer in schools, even though that will be a detriment to others, display of 10 Commandments, pray and work. They've had a number of successes in local legislatures and kind of getting that through.
So how would they secularize something like prayer and the 10 Commandments in schools? How would you get around that not being religious?
Yeah, well, one thing to say is, these things they'll just focus, drop back to religious liberty language, right? This is for everyone. This is for religious liberty for everyone. They kind of use that language, and they'll use kind of rights language to kind of cover up the fact that they don't really care about the rights of others. They just care about the rights of those that they want to see praying in schools.
Yeah, because the 10 Commandments say, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." But this is for everyone, right?
Yeah, there's a tension there, right? There's a tension. What's going on?
Yeah. So. So we're talking about these organizations like Alliance Defending Freedom and the Family Research Council, and we've been following groups like this for a long time. They spend a lot of money and time and resources to try to refute your claim, the SPLC's claim, that they are extremist hate groups, and they try to whitewash their images, as you can see right here. Why do you call them extremist hate groups and not just conservative groups?
Yeah, I mean, there's a great deal. There's so many things that are pressing issues for us in this country and the world. There's legitimate debate to be had by conservative, liberals, and kind of everyone in between, right? But you have groups like Alliance Defending Freedom and Family Research Council, and like you said, they want this very legitimate, very kind of mainstream veneer, right? That they are independent research groups, that they're just fighting for the rights of Christians, and again, not all Christians, just a subset, and that they're really fighting for rights, right? Well, when you start digging into their history and you start digging into what they're looking at and what they've said, you see that it's not just conservatism, right? There are a lot of conservatives out there who really believe strongly in human rights. And these groups represent extreme for example, anti-LGBTQ positions that really aren't representative of most Americans, including conservatives, if you do polls. And what they do is they try to sow mistrust in public institutions, such as education, and undermine public support for LGBTQ plus rights in the United States. So they're kind of attacking an entire population of the country. They're attacking their neighbors, which is very much against New Testament ethics. And we want to see a democracy where all people are welcome and they can thrive. But with the ADF, it is we've listed it as a group because it supported the idea that LGBTQ plus being queer should be a crime. And one of their researchers has even said that it's okay to put LGBTQ people in prison for engaging in consensual sex. They've supported laws that require forced sterilization of transgender Europeans. And they've pursued legal cases to reinstate sodomy laws in the U.S. And came to the legal defense of sterilization laws in foreign countries for trans individuals. And with FRC, they spread very harmful pseudoscience, just incorrect science. It's very difficult actually to call it science about LGBTQ people, kind of spreading misinformation to denigrate them as a people. And they have published books and reports and brochures that have linked homosexuality to pedophilia, claimed LGBTQ people like myself are dangerous to children, and also proclaimed that we are promiscuous and violent. And FRC had stated on its website, the Family Research Council believes that homosexual conduct is harmful to the persons who engage in it and to society at large and can never be affirmed. It is by definition unnatural and as such is associated with negative physical and psychological health effects. And if they actually step back, and especially trans members of this community, youth, LGBTQ youth, are very, very vulnerable, not just to attacks, but very vulnerable to suicide. And by pushing this line that is not based in any fact or any science, they're actually harming people. They're harming their neighbors.
It is based on the Bible, though. The Old Testament, at least, calls homosexuality an abomination, and their blood should be upon them, and they've been killed and persecuted because of a couple of verses in the Old Testament. But even Jesus said he came to uphold every jot and tittle of the law. So those people are using not reason, they're not using logic or even data, they're using just ancient scriptures to motivate their modern day hatred, aren't they?
Well, yeah, and there's a lot in those scriptures that people have found to uphold human rights, right? To uphold civil rights. The Bible is a complex compilation of texts written by people we don't know over centuries, right? Yeah. And there are tensions throughout that text. And so when somebody kind of, like you said, goes and says this one line, and they pull it out, and they make that absolutely fundamental to their faith, there's questions and pushbacks to be made about that, because not all Christians make that move. A lot of Christians look at that and say, no, that's wrong. Yeah. And so they try to engage with that. So I think it's a very insincere way of engaging this kind of proof texting, pulling from a text as complicated and old as this. Yeah.
Yeah, all this stuff that we've been talking about is very alarming, but what are some effective strategies or interventions that can be employed at the societal level to counter Christian nationalism?
A lot of Christian nationalism, you're talking about Michael Flynn, he has this phrase of local action equals national impact. And a lot of these groups, they're focusing on the local. They're focusing on your town council. They're focusing on your school board. And they're training people to go in and to, rile things up, throw a gear in the works, and stop what is just generally, local politics, local people trying to, get through with their everyday life. And they're highly politicizing this, but there are not that many people involved locally, usually. And what could really be powerful is if people locally take a real interest, an active, engaged interest in their local politics. Go to school board meetings, go to town council meetings, go with a few friends, right? And connect to local grassroots groups who are kind of doing this monitoring. I work with groups in some groups in different states who really do a lot of on the ground, difficult monitoring to track everything that's going on. Use that information, go into these meetings, and make sure that people know that this white Christian nationalism is not the only voice. It's not the only. It's not the only viable alternative out there. They can reach out if they're Christian to Christians Against Christian Nationalism, but also start with local grassroots groups. You can also just contact groups like SPLC, and we'll try to, if we know of any local groups, we'll try to connect them with you. And so there's a lot of stuff you can do, but I think that right now, at this moment, is where kind of the battle is.
You probably know Amanda Taylor in the Baptist Joint Committee. She's working with a group called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And she points out, we've had her on this show, that you can't paint them all with the same brush. There's, I guess, a distribution curve from extremists to more loving people. So should we do questions, or did you have something else you wanted to ask?
I think we can just go to questions probably if we have any.
Okay. Here's a question from our viewers. How does the Christian nationalist movement recruit people to their movement?
That's a good question. And I think picking up one you said about Amanda Tyler, usually when I think in this discussion, when we're thinking of white Christian nationalists, we're thinking of more extreme, kind of more on the right, right? They really want to transform culture and society and politics into something that's unrecognizable for us. A lot of this happens sometimes in churches. You'll have churches that are kind of aligned this way. I have heard sometimes, I haven't been able to really follow this, sometimes people will go into a Bible study and try to radicalize the group, but it does happen through churches, unfortunately. It happens on social media. I don't think we fully understand how radicalizing COVID was. The shooter in Buffalo, one of the ways that he was radicalized, I'm not saying necessarily he was a white Christian nationalist, but the way he was radicalized is he was isolated during COVID. And there's a lot of resources out there that will, if you go down certain rabbit holes, you'll go into some pretty grim places. So there's a lot of stuff being pushed out online that also will kind of grab people's attention. Then you do have things like the Reawaken America Tour, which is this roving revival, political revival, that people tap into, they get enthused by. They use this model, the kind of evangelical, charismatic model of really putting on a show. And that's what they do. And it kind of travels through the U.S. trying to keep people riled up. So there are a number of ways like this. And organizations, there are a lot of organizations like kind of local, more right-wing organizations that if you kind of just scratch the surface, you'll see that the leader is very, pro-white Christian nationalist. So you even see this kind of people get involved in a local organization because they're against vaccination mandates, or they think that the 2020 election was fraudulent, and they'll go into these groups, and those ideas, those white Christian nationalist ideas, will be there to support their assumptions. If that makes sense, if that kind of answers the question.
Yeah. So, well, I guess they do what they have to. Evangelism is reaching people, but we have another question about geography. Does the SPLC find that Christian nationalism has a higher concentration in certain areas? And if true, what makes those areas easier for them to establish it?
We haven't really looked at it geographically yet. I think that's a great question, and it's something that if I get some capacity, I'd actually like to do that. Are there hot spots, right? It's difficult to say at this point. I think that there's been some research out there saying that a lot of white Christian nationalists actually don't go to church, right? But then you do have work by PRRI and the Brookings Institution that says, no, people really get radicalized by this in church spaces, in church practices. So if you follow that, places where, if you want to call it like right-wing Christianity or whatnot is out there, you probably will find it more often. But that also kind of, you have to, if we're going to kind of make that conclusion, we have to be very careful and understand it's much more widespread than that. You can find it up in Massachusetts just as well as you can in, say, Mississippi or Alabama.
Well, I'm sure even here in Dane County, Madison, Wisconsin, which, by the way, is at least 50% non-religious. We're one of the highest in the nation for that. There are Christian nationalists here in this town that you probably run by on your runs. So there's one more question here. What's the best way to open up a conversation with someone that I'm concerned might be leaning towards Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I think you have to start with care. Take a playbook from some of the New Testament ethics, right? When you're sitting, somebody you care about, approach them with care, right? You're not trying to, radicalize them and make them believe everything that you believe. You kind of see them leaning into an ideology that doesn't really have a lot of great basis, not just in fact, but even like sociology, right? So what I would say is just, start having conversations, ask them questions, listen to them. kind of be that professorial person. And as they're, listening to them, kind of probe, ask more questions. Sometimes you get to the point, especially if you know the person, you have more intimacy, you might kind of get a little bit more of an emotional core about what's going on. Somebody just might be really afraid that the world that they knew they feel is disappearing, right? And so you can kind of then help them with that and help them find other resources, other avenues, other ways to learn how to live in the world, right? So I think that would be like the first piece. And I think then if you're going to really engage with somebody, go to resources like Christians Against Christian Nationalism and the Baptist Joint, it's a Baptist Joint Committee, right? Okay. They have resources there, and you can kind of get some language too, some of that, some Christian language, so that you're kind of speaking their talk and kind of meet them where they are. Because it's a lot easier to kind of stop someone as they're kind of going toward a more extreme position. Once they're there, it's much, much harder. And it doesn't help them, and it doesn't help anybody else.
I think it was your group that produced this graph. Is that right, Bruce? About how people really are not as religious as they say they are? Really?
Oh, yeah, about the separation of church and state, right?
Yeah. People say one thing because they're supposed to, but in their actual lives, they don't go to church as much as they think they go to church, or they don't, so maybe talking with one of those people about real core issues would make a difference.
I think it would. And, like a graph like this, it says, the separation of church and state is actually a really strongly and widely held value in the United States. Uh-huh. And it's allowed a lot of progress to be made in human rights, in recognizing different people. So, bringing something like this and kind of saying, this is why this is so valuable. People can be seen, people can thrive. Yeah.
I checked out the SPLC on Charity Navigator, which rates charities around the country. And like FFRF, you have the highest 4-star rating. It's a membership group, right? People can join and become members. How would they contact you?
If you just go to our website, we have information to contact right there. Our website has information just to kind of reach out. But I work in a part of the organization called the Intelligence Project, where we monitor extremism. If you kind of have questions or concerns just about that in particular, you can go to the website, send an email to us, and it will get to us. We also have a really great group called Learning for Justice. It's a part of SPLC, one of our departments that we work with, and they do an amazing job working with teachers, and I think they're kind of expanding beyond that, giving tools and resources for some of these questions that you've asked. So Learning for Justice is also a really good, valuable resource, and you can also reach out to them through the website as well if you have questions. People are very, very happy to help.
There's a lot of groups doing very good work on a lot of these issues, and I might remind viewers that FFRF with the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty produced a report called Christian Nationalism at the January 6th insurrection. So, well, thank you, Joe. That was really interesting. I wish we had more time to talk. Joe Wiinikka.
And that's a wonderful report. I tell anybody who hasn't, go out and read it right now.
And it's online too, so you can find it linked at our website or other places. So thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
And that concludes Ask an Atheist for this week.
Don't miss Free Thought Radio. This week, Annie, Laurie, and Dan will be talking with John Ward, author of the new book, Testimony, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation. You can find out how to hear Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio. If you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us.
We'll see you next week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.